So our last panel of the day, we had a little bit of a preview of it in the panel after lunch about putting a price on carbon. So we've got a couple of panelists. We're really pleased to have Kirk Walter here from the Clean Air Task Force based out of Boston. Kurt is based out of Columbus himself. Going to talk about sort of where we are at the federal level, various levels of government in terms of putting a price on carbon, where we need to be and how we're going to get there. And then Jim Probst from the West Virginia, he's a state coordinator for the Citizens Climate Lobby in West Virginia. He's going to tell us about some actual legislation that's being proposed, put a price on carbon, and then dividend that back to taxpayers. So, Kurt, who was going to go first, Kurt or Jim? Kurt, you want to go first? Okay, let me pull yours up, Jim.
There it is. So I thought I was going to have to go last, and I had a joke about that, but now I'm second to last. So anyway, I'm going to start with what seems to be all in vogue, which is, wait a minute. Spoiled that. You know, why is it advancing? So while he fixes it, so what seems to be in vogue, which is to go on TV and claim that you're not qualified to talk about what you're getting ready to talk about. But so, you know, by saying, well, I'm not a scientist, but, so, yeah, I'm not a scientist and I'm not an academic. My qualifications are those guys. Why is it advancing?
I guess somebody made it to automatically play. And that's kind of hard to undo right now.
I'm going to have a hard time keeping up with it. So, these are my qualifications for being here today. These are my grandkids. And I am thankful for being asked to be here today. I do appreciate it. So me, I'm a semi-retired furniture maker from Lincoln County, West Virginia. I'm also the state coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby. And then, like I said, here are my qualifications. Many agree that an essential first step in doing something about climate change is to put a price on carbon emissions. I'm going to speak on CCL's proposal. It's gotten kind of complicated because in the last week, our proposal went from being a proposal to an introduced bill in the House of Representatives. So I'm kind of using those terms interchangeably at this point. The bill that was introduced is very similar to the proposal that we've been advocating for 10 years now. So. And then I'm just going to speak very briefly to a group of us have a working group within Citizens Climate Lobby known as Coal Country, and we worked on a white paper that shows how carving out a very small percentage of a carbon fee could have a profound impact on a just transition for the coal fields. All right. So a little bit about Citizens Climate Lobby. We're growing so fast that they have a hard time keeping accurate slides. We actually have over 100,000 members at this point. We have chapters in every state in the country. We're in almost every congressional district at this point. We do have 484 chapters across the U.S. This is what we do twice a year. We go to D.C. and lobby Congress. Our big push is in June. We have our annual conference then. I think this picture is a couple of years old at this point. They've had to move to the other end of the Capitol to take the picture. There's this past June, there were 900 of us that went up to Capitol Hill in one day to lobby our members of Congress, and we hit over 520 congressional offices in one day. It's really something to be a part of. I find it very empowering. Everywhere you go on Capitol Hill on that day, in the hallways, you come out of an office, you run into other CCLers. You go to have lunch, the cafeterias are full of CCLers. There's no other organization that hits Capitol Hill as hard as we do. This is our lobby team from this past June. that was our lobby team for this past June. There it is. I think it was our best team yet. We had representatives from Charleston, Huntington, Parkersburg, Martinsburg, Morgantown, Harpers Ferry, Lincoln County, and Boone County. We had a reporter embedded with us from New York that was writing a story about our efforts, and we had lobbyists in age from 15 to 70 plus. It was a good team. So the basics of our policy is basically we put a starting price of $15 per ton on the carbon content of all fossil fuels. It would rise at a rate of $10 per year. All of the money would be returned to U.S. households in the form of a dividend. The way this would work is that if you have a household, let's say 2 adults and 2 children, each adult would account for 1 share and each child would count for 1/2 share. So that would be a total of 3 shares of the dividend. That's a maximum amount any family could receive. So it doesn't benefit you to have a whole bunch of kids. What it does is that it makes everything that's produced with fossil fuels, is transported with fossil fuels, if it has fossil fuels as part of its makeup, it's going to get more expensive. And anything that's made with renewable fuels, conversely, is going to become more competitive in the marketplace. The end result is that people are going to transform away from fossil fuel use into more renewable and sustainable forms of energy. Our policy also includes a border adjustment. What's known as a border adjustment, where let's say you're China and you want to import goods into the U.S., we're going to calculate the amount of carbon that was put into the atmosphere to produce your item, and we're going to charge you when it comes into the United States. Conversely, if you are a U.S. manufacturer and want to export goods to a country that doesn't have an equivalent price on carbon, you're going to receive a rebate at the border so that you're not competing, you're not being unfairly disadvantaged in the world marketplace. I can't even read this one now. The only reason I included this one was statement, the second from the right on the bottom. It reduces inequality. The poor are more carbon virtuous inherently. I really like that. I strive to be carbon virtuous. But the top 1% of earners consume 6 times as much carbon dioxide as the bottom 10%. So the way it's going to work is the people that use the most carbon, they're the ones that are going to pay the most in the form of a fee. So it's already been in place. A similar type program has been in place in British Columbia for 10 years now. They're at $30 a ton, mostly because they're not rising up until the rest of Canada puts a carbon fee in place, which is going to happen this next year. And but it's been successful there. Their use of gas on this chart has gone down. Their economy has grown, jobs have grown. And I've spoken with people from there that say they hardly even notice it. So in 2014, we had a study done by a firm known as Regional Economic Models Incorporated, and they looked at what effect our policy would have on jobs, saved lives, how much it would reduce our emissions, what effect it would have on our gross domestic product, and what sort of dividend we would be looking at for families. First thing they found was that over the first 10 years of our policy, 2.1 million jobs would be created. After 20 years, 2.8 million jobs. It would reduce our emissions within the first 10 years, 31% over 1990 levels, and after 20 years, 50% over those same levels. A family of 4 after 10 years would be receiving $288 per month in the form of dividend, or $3,456 a year. After 20 years, that dividend would go up to $396 a month, or $4,752 per year. I'm afraid I'm going to run long, so I'm going to. We have had another study done, household impact study, which basically shows that the bottom 4 portion of our economy would all come out at either even or ahead. In other words, they would receive more money back in the form of a dividend that they would incur in increased expenses due to our policy. To me, this is one of the most significant. I don't know why this isn't talked about more in this country. Right now, we presently have 60,000 premature deaths a year in this country from our air quality. And this is, so this is so the rest of us can enjoy the benefits of fossil fuels. And the current administration's proposed changes to the Clean Power Plan will actually result in an increase in 16,000 premature deaths in this country. And this area of West Virginia is an area that will see a more profound increase. So in summary, REMI found that our policy would create jobs, it would reduce our carbon emissions, it would increase household incomes, it would save lives, and would actually grow our gross domestic product. I threw in a few charts from the REMI report. It's available. It's a 50-some page report that's available on our website. But basically what this shows is going to see the biggest increase in jobs in the health sector. People are going to have more money to take care of themselves. And if you go all the way down to the bottom of the chart, I don't think you'll be surprised that the biggest loser is mining. So over a 20-year period, we're looking at the end of a 20-year period, somewhere in the ballpark of $70 billion in income a year, $70 billion from the dividend. That's when you combine the border adjustment and with the fees collected. I threw this one in here just because it shows that all of fossil fuels are going to go up. Electricity, after going up for about 10 years, I think, will start to come down because electricity can convert to renewable forms of energy production. And then for West Virginia, this is maybe the most significant graph at all. The one on the left is with no carbon price. Coal is the blue area at the bottom. So if you go to the right side of the chart, you can see coal has a very dramatic drop-off in production. As a matter of fact, in the text of the REMI report, it says that after 10 years, the United States would quit using coal to produce electricity because it would no longer be economically viable. Last time I looked, 93% of the coal mined in this country goes to make electricity, so you're pretty much shutting down the coal industry. On the right, it does show in the blue hatched area some coal hanging around with carbon capture, and so the orange, I'm vision challenged at the moment, so bear with me. The right and orange are gas, and once again, the orange hatched area is natural gas, and it shows it benefiting from some carbon capture. Just to give you an example of how fuel prices would be affected by this, gasoline would go up 9 cents for every $10 in carbon fee charge. So the first year out of the gate, we're looking at about 13.5 cents a gallon increase in gasoline prices, and then it would be going up about 9 cents a year. And so when I first started doing this work, I didn't really look real hard at how it would affect coal prices, and it's dramatic. So Evan kind of touched on this earlier, but coal emits anywhere from 1.9 to 2.8 tons of carbon dioxide for every ton you burn. So we took an average of 2.3 tons of carbon dioxide emission, and if you apply that to starting out $15 a ton fee, first year $34.50 fee would be applied to coal. After year 2, it'd be $57.50. Year 3, $80.50 fee, and at the end of year 10, we'd be looking at $230 a year, ton tax on coal. Obviously, that's not going to be competitive. So, like I said earlier, a small group of us worked on a paper. I have copies of it. If it just interests anyone, we looked at carving out 0.67 of 1% of CCL's proposal, which has the potential to return $20 billion over the first 10 years of our policy for a just transition in the coal fields. We could allocate $9 billion over that period of time to help in coal worker transition. and another $11 billion for replacing lost revenue to coal states and coal communities. It goes into a lot more detail. I'm not going to do that right now. This is just some of the different transition type benefits we looked at that we could offer to coal workers. So the big news, and I'm really excited about this. I've been working on with CCL for 5 years now. We have a bill. A bill was introduced into the House of Representatives last week, sponsored by Ted Deutsch from Florida. It very closely mirrors our legislation. It's the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It had 4 original co-sponsors. There's already a third Republican has signed on, a Republican from Michigan, to be a co-sponsor. And, they introduced it in the lame duck. I know it's not going to pass in the lame duck, but it's getting people talking about this approach, which I think is just really important. The intention is to reintroduce in the next Congress, and it has given something concrete to work towards. Similarities are, it starts at the same level, $15 a ton, it goes up $10 a year. It does cover other greenhouse gas emissions. I didn't cover those. All net revenue is returned to American households at the same rate. The carbon dividend would be counted as income, but it wouldn't be applied for like social programs, and it would have a border adjustment. The differences are that there is a provision in the bill for carbon capture, which I think is probably going to be of interest to people like Representative McKinley, who has introduced several different bills that include tax credits on carbon capture. There's some provisions for diesel used for agriculture. There's some regulatory stuff that, there's some provisions for that it could be ended if it meets certain emissions figures. And one thing I think is pretty interesting is they're proposing to start the dividend a month before they start applying the fee. So that means households are going to get a check a month before the fee is starting to be applied to our carbon emissions. And that's it.
Let me see if I can make this work. There we go. So I am also very happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you about something that's very near and dear to our hearts, which is how are we going to get to a decarbonized world. And I am the one going last. I don't have a good joke. Jim, you should have told me in advance so we could have switched. So I'll just try and be as interesting and compelling as possible at 10 till 5. Cleaner Task Force is we're an environmental NGO. We're based in Boston. We're kind of a virtual office, so I live in Columbus, Ohio, but I do hail from Parkersburg, so I've got some roots, and my siblings are alumni. I'm sorry I went to Ohio State, but everyone else went to WVU, and I'm very happy to be here. So let's see if I can get this working. That didn't work. That didn't work either. Maybe if I do it the old school, use the arrow bar. Yeah, there we go. So, getting a carbon pricing past the federal level is incredibly politically challenging, but I want to kind of step back from that. I want to step back from policy designs. I want to step back from the politics and really talk about what we're trying to do. First, we need to focus on when. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said we need to zero out all energy system and industrial system emissions globally in the next 50 years if we're going to limit temperature growth to 2 degrees. And if that's not incredibly difficult enough, once we get past that, we're going to have to start to go carbon negative. And that's just to limit 2-degree temperature growth. If we're going to be more ambitious and limit it to 1.5 degrees, which is gives us a little bit of comfort in terms of what might happen to our planet, then all of that has to happen by 2050. So time is very short. So that's the when. The where is something we don't pay enough attention to collectively, I think. We talk about the US a lot. We talk about Europe sometimes. But if you look at the map on the lower left, this is a map we did to illustrate where the emissions in the future are really going to be coming from. The US is, and the size of the country illustrates the relative amount of emissions. The US is still about what it normally looks like. China and India are huge relative to their footprint. The Pacific Rim is also extremely large. The Middle East looms large. That's because as economic development happens, what we're going to see is countries, what's projected to happen is countries are going to go to the lowest cost technology that they can to have their economies develop, which is understandable. In India, about 1/3 of the population has no access to electricity at all. That has huge implications for health and the well-being of the folks living in those areas. The rest of the population has access to only intermittent electricity. So we're going to see a significant amount of growth that, unless we change the technology options, are going to be very carbon intensive and clearly put us beyond where we need to go. Just as an example, in China, about 3 or 4 years ago, they had developed 900 gigawatts of coal plants. That's 3 times as many that we have in the US. And at that point, the Chinese government put on what they called a coal cap policy, which was to tended to limit the growth of coal and coal plants. We have recently found out that they've sort of blown through that cap, and they've now added another 300 to 400 gigawatts of coal. So now there are 4 times as many coal plants as we have. And unlike our aging coal fleet, they're all new. Those plants by themselves could not just meet our limited carbon budget that was talked about earlier, it would blow through it. So it isn't just about the US. We have to think about the world. So following that example, if the planet is really, if the fate of the planet, the fate of us is really on the line, which we believe it is, then we can't just focus on 1 or 2 technology options. We really need multiple technology options that are available and will be taken up, that are affordable enough to be taken up, where all these emissions are going to come from. So that clearly means wind and solar. We've made a lot of progress there. It also means carbon capture and storage. It probably means advanced nuclear. It probably means other technologies like zero carbon fuels. We definitely need to move forward on electrification. But there's a lot of work to do to get all these options developed in a time frame that matters. So that's, I'm going to try and move on to the good news as we go on, but I want to start with the level set of where we're starting from and what we need to do. So in our view, I'm going to tell you what we think, at least from Cleaner Task Force perspective, what we need to do, and then why we think that. We think we need to, by 2035, have multiple zero carbon technology options that provide at least 1% of the world's primary energy production. They need to be cost competitive, and they need to be capable of deploying at a rapid pace. That's about, just to give a sense of scale, that's like 200 gigawatts of nuclear power. That sounds enormous, but it's relatively small compared to the amount of energy that gets produced in the world. And so the reason why we picked that number, that 1%, is because historically, if you look at how all the energy technologies that we have now in our global system have come into effect, what researchers have found is that there's that 1% level is kind of a threshold. Once you cross that level, that's when the energy technologies tend to diffuse throughout the global energy system. So we think we need multiple technologies to meet that level and be able to be taken up by the developing countries at an affordable price. So if you look at the lower left-hand chart, what you see is, what do we have today? This is the world's primary energy production. Most of it, not surprisingly, comes from coal, oil, and gas. And that's unabated. There's no carbon capture on that. That's where all of our emissions are coming from. There's a little circle down on the right of that chart that shows where wind and solar is relative to the rest of the world's primary energy production. And that may look kind of depressing initially, but this is actually very good news. In a relatively short period of time, we've got wind and solar up to the point where it's close to that very important threshold level. It's close to that 1% level. And my personal guess is I think solar is more likely to accelerate faster past wind as they get through that level. So that's positive. What is a little less positive is we've done that with kind of current wind and solar technology, and we haven't accounted for the variability that comes from wind and solar. As it really penetrates throughout the system, you need storage, you need more advanced forms of wind and solar. And what we've learned over the past 2 decades is that we really know how to get new technologies out there. We know if you put tax incentives out for wind and solar, if you require their use through renewable portfolio standards, then those technologies will go into the system and they'll do so rapidly. So we've learned a lot, but we need to apply that to a broader range of technologies, including more advanced wind and solar. Nuclear, that clearly went past the threshold, but if you look at the cost of nuclear power plants today in sort of the developed world, it's very expensive. So that pretty much stalled out a while ago. Carbon capture and storage, it's emerging, but it's clearly not at a level where you're going to see it on any chart. The chart on the right talks about the cost, and I promise this is the last high level that I'm going to talk about. But if you look at those 2 horizontal bars, that's kind of the cost of gas power and coal power. So as I mentioned, if you add on the variability part, if you address the variability part of wind and solar, and you look at the other technologies, we really don't have a good option, zero carbon option at the threshold level. And we absolutely need one, and that's why we need carbon pricing. That's going to be a crucial policy to get technologies to where we need it to go. So where are we? Well, I think has been talked about before. Some companies in the private sector have actually made some pretty impressive commitments. They're voluntary, so you have to take that for what it's worth, but the fact that they're putting themselves out there is very impressive. Xcel Energy has committed to 80% reduction by 2030. American Electric Power, 80% reduction by 2050. The others, it's sort of in the same range. So it's very important that they've made this commitment, even if it's voluntary. But what is not being committed to is 100%. And the difference between 80% and 100% is the difference between a zero carbon world and a world where we fall short. Google has been a pioneer in this in terms of buying power. They first made a pledge of 100% renewables, which they met. And what they found, because of the variability, is that 100% renewables wasn't actually zero emissions. So now they're retooling what they're doing to figure out how they can actually make their, really meet 100% zero emissions commitment. These are positive. The policy landscape is more of a mixed bag. We've been pretty active as an organization in the efforts to use the Clean Air Act to try and drive emissions reductions. So the Obama administration put together what the two rules. One they called the Clean Power Plan, which dealt with existing coal-fired power plants, and one called the Carbon Pollution Rule, which dealt with new plants. We were very active in supporting the development of those rules and defending them against litigation. The Carbon Pollution Rule in particular was very important because it set a limit on how much emissions could come from coal-fired power plants based on the technology of carbon capture and storage. So if coal plants were to be built, and they believe they could live in a carbon-constrained world, they'd have to put their money where their mouth was and build and add CCS. We're now in a situation where EPA is attempting, under the current administration, to push that back and change the regulations in a way that we actually think isn't supportable by the law. So our view is that this fight ain't over yet, and we think that going forward, we're going to have some degree of progress on holding the line. At the state level, there's some very exciting things happening. California adopted their bill SB 100, which is going to require zero emissions, a carbon-free energy system, power system in California by 2045. The governor followed that up with an executive order saying that the entire energy system, not just power plants, but the industrial system and the transportation system, is going to be net negative by that same time period. So this is an example of how states can really show leadership. It's California, I know. That doesn't exactly set the tone for West Virginia. But when you look at what utilities are doing in terms of where they think they can go, when you look at the technology options that are becoming available, a requirement that focuses on getting to a zero carbon state, a zero carbon system, may have more plausible political legs in other parts of the country than just California. At least we think that's a possibility. Congressional bills under consideration. The last time we had a serious bill in Congress under consideration, that was the Waxman-Markey bill, which, as I think was mentioned before, was notably shot hole through it through Senator Manchin in one of his ads. But that was actually kind of a foreshadowing of what happened with that bill. It didn't have the political legs that it needed to get through Congress, even though there was support from the Obama administration, support from a Democratic House, and support from a Democratic Senate. It's very difficult politically to get this kind of legislation forward. That's not to say that it is important to keep focused on it. We need to keep moving in that direction, but it's also important to understand that it is difficult and to think about why. So this is my favorite example to explain this, and I think we heard over lunch from Space Gal why some people can make statements that are seemingly irrational. So Senator Inhofe, James Inhofe from Oklahoma, is a notable climate critic. He's perhaps most famous for going onto the Senate floor and holding up a snowball and throwing it at his colleagues to prove that global warming isn't real. And he said last year, I assumed, like everybody else, way back when everyone was talking about global warming and all that, I assumed that was probably right until I found out what it was going to cost. So how does the science and the fact that it costs a lot, how do those two things relate? Well, I think it's I think actually a really refreshing, candid remark that basically says cost matters. We really care about what it's going to cost, and that's going to be the most important thing to us. And having that as a stated position, I think is actually helpful because it gives you a sense of what you're really trying to address. And interestingly enough, Congress actually did put a price on carbon last February, and not many people have noticed this, but, and I should also add, Senator Inhofe voted for it. And the way that happened was there was a bipartisan support for what was called the Future Act, which was a incentive for carbon capture and storage based on the kind of incentive that has existed for wind and solar. It's a tax credit that would apply for carbon capture on coal plants, gas plants, industrial sources like ethanol, and also carbon removal, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it in the ground. And why would you support taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it in the ground if you didn't think climate was a problem? Nonetheless, this had 25 co-sponsors in the Senate and 50 in the House, both Democrat and Republican, including some very strong critics on taking climate action. Similarly, there was a coalition of climate hawks, people like Cory Booker and Sheldon Whitehouse, along with climate critics, very conservative members of the Senate, supporting NECA, a bill that promoted advanced nuclear technology development. So what we're finding is that innovation, even bills that actually matter for innovation, not just bills that sort of say, we'll do R&D for 25 years and maybe something will happen, is starting to get a little bit of traction in Congress, and that's actually important. Recently, just last week, Senators Barrasso, Sass, and Tillis have all started messaging around innovation as something that they want to focus on with respect to addressing climate change. So that's positive. It's a risk. It's positive if we see more real bills or more real legislation that actually moves technology forward. It's a risk if it becomes a talking point that says, we don't really need any kind of serious action, and by the way, the private sector will really take care of most of this. So it's one of those things where, on the one hand, there's some positive aspects to it, but on the other hand, we need to be pretty clear about what that really means. So here's where we are. The states and the private sector are showing leadership. It's true that we haven't seen a version of the SB 100 in California, but we have seen other efforts in states to get serious emissions reductions, state initiatives in play. We have seen companies, utilities that even as early as 5 years ago refused to provide any detail about how they might meet serious emissions reduction requirement, make actual commitments to meet those goals. We are seeing interesting efforts in terms of innovation at the federal level. And we might be tempted to stop and say, well, why not just stop there? If we can make progress in the states, if we can move forward collectively on innovation policy with a broad political consensus, isn't that sufficient? Isn't that enough? It might be, except going back to the first point, that time matters. We have limited time to create multiple options to get us to a zero carbon world. If we don't make progress on getting to the really powerful combination of incentives and requirements, then we're unlikely to meet that. We've seen from wind production tax credits and renewable portfolio standards. We've even seen when we put scrubbers on and NOx controls on coal-fired power plants, that this combination of incentives with standards that tell you when you have to reduce your emissions is extremely powerful, and utility companies are starting to embrace that certainty. I think it was mentioned before that the Trump administration is rolling back or attempting to roll back the conventional air emission limits that was put in place over the past 8 to 12 years. What's really astonishing is that the utility companies have been opposing that. And the reason they've been opposing that is because they've already made all those capital investments. They don't want their utility commissioners to say, well, no requirement, you guys are just gonna have to eat the cost. They understand the value of certainty. So we're at a really interesting moment where there's a lot of different forces coming together that could help us make progress and get that kind of carbon pricing and those kind of emission limits in place. I don't know what the magic formula is to get there, but I do know that if we don't show the leadership in the U.S. to move it forward and get to that place, then we're not gonna see emissions reductions in the U.S., we're not gonna see any movement where the emissions are really going to matter, which is China, India, Africa, where all of that development activity is gonna happen. So those are my remarks. Thank you.
Got time for just a couple of questions. Kurt, a question for you. Were healthcare costs measured for the carbon price study in Canada? And if so, did they show any marked reduction?
Is that for me or for Jim?
For Kurt, it says for you.
Which study are you referring to?
This is, you had it though, didn't you, Jim, the healthcare costs for Canada?
I quit listening after you said.
Were healthcare costs measured for the carbon price study in Canada? And if so, did they show any marked reduction?
Oh, the British Columbia.
The British Columbia,
I'm afraid I can't answer that.
okay.
I can say that healthcare costs have been taken into account originally in the Obama administration's rule on the carbon, or the Clean Power Plan on the carbon pollution rule. EPA is required by law to do a cost-benefit analysis for every rule they put out. And in this case, they included the health impacts related to both reducing emissions, reducing emissions as well as there are two things that are relevant. One are the smokestack emissions, and the other are the fact that in a warming world, all of the smog and soot type of chemistry happens even more intensely. Both of those things were taken into account in those rules.
Jim, this is for you. Metallurgical coal is an issue. What would a carbon tax do to the steel industry in terms of steel prices?
Good question. Well, once again, I mean, it is, it's going to affect the price. And, I mean, I haven't looked at those numbers, so I can't answer that, with any kind of figures, but
I guess those figures you were talking about, something like $34 increase in the price of a ton of coal?
well, $34.50 first year.
Yeah, so I guess you could run the numbers and see what that would do to steel, depending upon how many tons are, anyway.
Right.
Can you speak about where carbon pricing has been implemented around the world and share some success stories?
Well, as it turns out, almost all of our major trading partners have some form of carbon pricing. I haven't spent as much time looking at that as I probably should, but I was on a webinar just recently, and it was talking about, with this bill introduction, if you're exporting goods to a country without an equivalent fee, there's that issue. But as it turns out, most of our major trading partners already have carbon fees in place, or carbon pricing of different types. And once again, I'm doing a terrible job of answering questions, but I don't have any more detail on that.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, no.
I think it's important to think about carbon pricing not just as literally a price on carbon, but the renewable portfolio standards are a requirement that have a similar kind of impact on the system. And those have been extremely successful, matched with the kind of incentives we were talking about just a minute ago. At the same time, the European trading system, it's a little mixed. And I think that's why it's important to kind of broaden that concept of a carbon price. I think having a market signal like that is very important, but I'm not sure it's sufficient. I think we have to have the kind of incentives that move technologies forward paired with that. And I think when you see that, that's when you see the biggest impacts.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you very much. Do you want to introduce Rafe? Is Rafe still here? Yeah. Is Rafe still here? Yeah. There he is, okay.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to see all these people here at 5 o'clock. My God, this is the real testimony to an audience. Because I've been to a few conferences where you sort of dribble it away. You got that one person in the back of the room. I'm just so happy that this conference has gone as well as it has, and I attributed about 50-50 to the audience and to these fabulous panelists. I mean, we really lucked out. And when Jamie said that, I don't think having a speaker like Emily Calandrelli, even though she has got a lot of letters after her name that she can deploy if she needs to, but somebody who's got that flair, I don't think that's normal for the WVU Law School. I sat where you are sitting right now. I remember vividly the fall of 1978 when I was a first-year law student here, and I don't suppose I could have ever imagined that I'd be back here 40 years later for an event like that, and yet it seems to be perfectly natural. So thanks everybody for coming. We're going to have many more generations of young people coming through WVU Law School, and if we can keep on bringing them to events like this and making this law school a place where this kind of dialogue occurs, then the law school's got a fabulous future. So on behalf of my alma mater, I thank you for showing up and being part of something that made it really special. You did good. Here's Rafe Pomerantz.
What do I do now? As Tom said, it's amazing that you all are still here. It's fantastic, and actually is an indicator of something. Tom said, if you're coming up, you close the meeting, and little did I know that I have been through, well, how do you do this? How do you do this? Normally I have an answer, but it's not easy because we've heard so many insightful words from the panelists, and good questions. So just a few thoughts. To go back to Ann Chester's opening remarks, if anybody remembers them, so you used the word Anthropocene. Remember that? That's the good news and that's the bad news. And she talked about the multi-generational nature of this. Once again, kind of some bad news and good news. The lifetime of carbon means this is a multi-generational issue. The fact that so much heat has already been absorbed into the ocean makes this a multi-generational issue. And she referred to the insight of the Anthropocene that human beings, Homo sapiens actually, is a species problem, are this enormous force on the planet. We are making geologic scale change. CO2 has never really risen at the rate that has happened since the great acceleration started after World War II of economic growth. So the Homo sapien population, that is us, is creating global scale planetary change in a huge hurry. Now, with all kinds of consequences, and we've heard just a bit about that. Well, that's the bad news. The good news here is that we're in charge. We have to take charge of the planet. The planet's not going to take care of itself anymore. That's been true since the rise of civilization. But the carbon problem changes the relationship of our species to the planet. So we have to have a kind of a new framework for our job. We are caring for the planet on a global scale. We are managing the energy balance of this planet. And if we don't, big trouble ahead. Let me just refer to what I call a climate car. When I started, I climbed into this climate car in 1979, and everything you could see was through the windshield. That is to say, everything was in front of us. Everything was in front of us. Now, yes, there's an enormous amount of change through the windshield, but if you look, you turn up and you look at the rear view mirror, and you see climate impacts behind us. You look out the driver's window, your passenger's window, they're happening rapidly. So rapidly you can barely read the literature. on impacts. There's so many papers of things going on. So we've gone from sort of this period where, until Jim Hansen proclaimed in 1988 that the temperature of the Earth had gone beyond natural variability, it was all prospective. Now, not so. And this is in an amazingly short period of time. I love what Tom did. He put parts per million on everybody's badge. What was that, birth dates or no?
Yeah, birthdays.
How'd you know all that?
I got a chart.
You got a chart. That's impressive. Okay, I thought that was a brilliant thing to do. I look back at when I started in this, and I cannot believe we were closer to pre-industrial levels of CO2 then. You know, we've moved further than that to today. It's incredible. So, okay. Next thought. We've heard, what I would call this, and in fact, this is kind of a West Virginia framework. We need a more vocal, bigger, better organized West Virginia framework. West Virginia is pivotal. Can you believe it? But it's pivotal because it is a coal mining state. And the politics here, the reason the United States is not in the forefront of this is because of the politics of coal states more than anything else. And we have to address that. And what I hear is all the pieces of it. This is my assertion. You can disagree. But you're critical. And that the issue is now forced upon you. No choice. Because Joe Manchin is probably going to become the ranking member of the Senate Energy Committee. So, no more shooting at cap and trade. No more. That's out. Game is over. The planet is warming too fast. That's simply not paying attention, simply asserting that you're going to be able to keep coal production up to the level that the West Virginia economy is okay, won't do it. We need an alternative future. And Senator Manchin is in the position to help bring that about. I know you have a question. Go ahead. What do you mean once a week? Once a day. So, okay, right, that's a good trade. I'm going to turn this 5 minutes worth over to you, okay? I'm going to ask people, what's the best idea you have if you wanted to say something to Joe Manchin? Or what's the most important thing you could do in this state to turn the debate? Does anybody have an idea? Yes, sir.
We tend to avoid the direct confrontation with the fact that this fight is a political fight. This is what you're getting at. But you still kind of are moving around the edges. There's no way to avoid the fact that we have to go to war in the trenches politically. And to answer the question that you just asked, what I would like to do when I go to see Senator Manchin is to say I represent a statewide coalition that has been formed over the last 2 years of every single person that understands the impact, the importance of climate change, and I represent tens of thousands of people. And we are here to tell you that you are going to get on board with trying to help us turn this thing around, or you're going to suffer the consequence. You and every other West Virginia politician is going to suffer the consequences come election day. Anything short of that is self-deception. Because this is a political fight. You were kind of saying that, but you didn't come out and say it in so many words. We have to stop being so good-natured, and we have to teach them how to war.
Okay, that's one great, well, good job. Anybody else? Come on, who else has an idea? You've been sitting here all day. You must have an idea. Yes?
Two groups that are not.
You want to stand up so we can all hear you?
Two groups that are not represented on the panel and that I was looking forward to. One are health professionals that I think are highly invested in the climate change issue, and the other is the faith-based communities, which I think are pillars of influence in the state of West Virginia, especially around climate change.
Good. Excellent. Okay.
On board.
Health and faith-based. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask any climate change denier if they're so confident in
science, that they would gamble their grandchildren's future on it.
Okay?
Can I speak to that? We, out here on this table, and this is a shameless plug as much as anything, but out here.
We support that.
Is a, I thought you did. Out here on this table is Mid-Ohio Valley Climate Action. We're a group out of Parkersburg. We kind of work in Ohio as well. And you'll notice we have these bumper stickers that say, "Save the grandchildren." And that's what we're all about. That's our slogan. We're working on that. We've got billboards in Parkersburg we've had up for 6 months about solar energy. We've got kids who are in a contest for money that we're going to award this coming Thursday for public service announcements on TV and radio about climate change. And where we're going to be holding those awards is at a notoriously conservative religious school in Parkersburg. And those are the people who won the awards for the PSA. They submitted them. So we work with everybody, and we got to be willing to have that coalition who will go to Senator Manchin and everybody else and say, we're bringing everybody, everybody from the Pope's encyclical and all of this to across the board. So just so you know, there's a table of a group out here. We're doing exactly what you're talking about. And this gentleman who told you that we need to teach them how to war is a founder of it. So we're on.
Terrific.
In Parkersburg, we're really working hard.
I haven't heard from anybody over here. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so about a month ago, watching the news, and there was this fire, and people couldn't drive fast enough away from the fire. It was the Paradise Fire.
Yeah.
So I think it's great to say it's for our grandchildren, but really it's for our children and ourselves.
Right.
You're 60, so your grandchildren, 45, children, you're 25.
I have to comment on that. The best protest poster I've read about with Trump occurred outside the Paradise Fire as Trump visited. He said, "Moron, we're in a drought." I thought, well, this guy really got it. Because actually, you should look, there's a website called Drought Monitor of the federal government. It comes out every Thursday. They revise it. If you look at it, the entire western United States is in a deep drought, all of California. Now, then the question becomes, can you assign this drought, which has been going on for several years, to climate change? Well, there's good reason to think at least part of it, maybe all of it. Yes?
Probably the best news I've heard, and a comment that we ought to make over and over again, was from Alden Long's presentation. The fastest growing job category in the United States is solar panel installer. Number 2 is wind turbine technician.
Right.
Let's talk about jobs.
There you go. All right. One more. Who's got the last word? Yes, ma'am.
Well, in speaking about jobs, I was thinking about all these wells that need to be plugged.
Yeah.
Why can't the universities develop some kind of innovative technology, maybe using recycled materials or something, to plug those wells and create a whole bunch of jobs for West Virginians? Because those jobs aren't going anywhere. They're here, and there's thousands of wells.
There's a one-liner in Plug the Wells that just might really work, you know? The Green New Deal, isn't there a piece for plugging the wells in the Green New Deal? There should be. You know what I mean? Right. Okay. Anybody else have a burning idea? Well, the fact that, let me just repeat, the fact that you're all here, I'm so glad I came. To see how much interest, sophistication, and really support there is to work on this here in pivotal West Virginia. So thank you. I'm glad. I think we're done, right? Yeah. Okay.